This episode of Lucky Paper Radio is brought to you by Proxies. While every other Magic podcast is trying to get you to buy cards from whatever site sponsors them, with a confusing array of coupon codes and unique URLs, allow us to be the one show to tell you that you can just write Jace the Mind Sculptor on an island with a Sharpie if you want. No one's going to haul you away to prison for doing so. Thanks, Proxies, for sponsoring this episode. To Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here with my co-host, Anthony, the lone co-host of Lucky Paper Radio, Maddox.
It's a little bit of a quieter podcast this week.
I gotta say, I really had a lot of fun last weekend, but it is nice to be back in the studio with just you and not 12 people. That was quite a bit to handle.
Yeah, it was a great weekend. I definitely had to... I had planned to take a day off of work in advance, which was
smart.
Good idea because I just needed to anti-socialize for a day,
yeah.
Especially after, not leaving the house and seeing people for 2 years or however long it's been.
Yeah, it was a lot, but still fun nonetheless. Glad people came down and played some Cube, and I hope that the episode last week wasn't too insufferable. Based on the download numbers, it seems like it was pretty insufferable. But
oh, no.
What are you going to do? It's weird. I don't know how that works. It's a very common thing in podcasts where if you have a bad episode, maybe the audio is messed up or something screwed up, you get less downloads on it. But how does anyone know until they've downloaded the episode to find out?
Algorithms.
I guess. I don't know. I don't know how that happens. But we're back in the studio today. We're doing a normal episode of Lucky Paper Radio, which is to say we're going to be sinking our teeth into some weird, abstract magic theory. Specifically on this episode, we are going to be talking about one-drops, one-mana spells. Are one-drops and one-mana spells the same thing? And how this unique mana cost demands, I think, specific attention in cube design that is perhaps distinct from other mana values along the curve. So we'll get to that after we do our Pack One Pick One from a listener-submitted cube. Our cube this week is an interesting one. It comes to us from listener Donato, and this is a cube that is a very old-school cube. It's designed to feel like playing Magic in 1996, as Donato puts it. But importantly, before drafting the regular cube, everyone gets to draft a pack of Vanguard cards. Anthony, do you know the history of Vanguard cards? I feel like it's something you might know.
I don't know if I know the history so much, but I know there were a set of cards that all give you... It's sort of like a companion. You start the game with some special rules, like an emblem in play, and they also modify your starting life total and starting hand size. I don't really know how they were originally released or packaged.
Okay, I don't either. Maybe we should have Googled that. I'm not sure. It seems like it was... They are not legal Magic cards in any sense. You can't play them in any format of anything. But they were made by Wizards of the Coast, and it seems like it was a supplemental, different way to play Magic, along the lines of like a Plains Chase kind of thing, where it was like, here's a different kind of set of cards you can play Magic with.
And the actual cards are even that large, oversized format.
Oh, they are. They're oversized. Yeah. That explains why the text is so small in them in Scryfall. That makes a lot of sense that they're oversized. So before we do the regular Pack One Pick One, we're going to do a Pack One Pick One from a 3-card Vanguard pack. This might be a little hard to follow, but I think we can maybe help people along the way. So our Vanguard cards are Selenia, Hannah, and Tangarth. Selenia gives all of our creatures vigilance and also modifies our starting hand size to be one additional card and our starting life total to be 27 instead of 20. And these cards all just start in play in the command zone. They can't be interacted with. You don't have to pay any cost for them. They just affect your basically starting state of the game. So give all your creatures vigilance, additional card in your hand, and 7 more life. Already seems very powerful to me.
Definitely. I mean, this is the pick so far.
Then we got Hannah. This one says your spells cost 1 less to play. Now that I'm interested in. Also gives us an additional card in our starting hand, but our life total is starting at 15 instead of 20. And then we have Tangarth. This says your creatures are unaffected by summoning sickness. Everybody has haste. 1 less card in our starting hand, and 7 additional life, so starting at 27. That one seems a little weird to me. It feels like an aggro card in the sort of smaller hand size.
But then you start with a bunch of extra life.
And then you just get 7 points of extra life, which is a decent chunk. Anthony, what's your pick out of these 3 Vanguard cards before we dive into this cube draft?
So I feel pretty confident in my choice here, actually. I think that it's a little bit difficult to evaluate because I haven't played with these cards before, and it's like a really warping effect, right? Like it really just changes the whole game. And we've talked about companions and how big of an impact it is that you always have access to them. It's not like one card in your deck that you sometimes draw, sometimes don't. And these are all really powerful effects. But I think that Hannah giving you a cost reduction on all of your spells is kind of insane. I can't
Pretty
imagine
busted.
this is not the most busted one. And I'm really shocked when I look down. I was like, okay, well, clearly you're going to start with 3 less cards in hand or something. But no, she even gives you an extra card. So it's kind of like can we call it a colorless Moxen that always draws you 2 cards and is always in your opening hand?
Yes,
and
I
it's
think
even
you can
better
call
if
it
you're
that.
double spelling. So I think that's pretty clearly the most powerful one here.
I definitely agree in a vacuum. I think if I had not looked at the cube prior to this, I would be taking Hannah not close, like way better than the other ones. However, I'm going to be a little spicy here. I'm going to metagame this a little bit. The 96 cube, the cards are pound for pound pretty poor by modern power level standards. This is the kind of game we are going to be winning with like a 4-mana 2/4 flyer or something. The bodies are really unimpressive. And I think this effect, this making spells cost less mana, does scale with the power of the environment. Just taking Hannah before drafting my own cube or your regular cube would by far be the most powerful one, not even close. I think in this environment, I actually might start on Selenia, which is spicy. I'm metagaming this. I'm taking a risk here, but I'm going to take Selenia and just assume that my win condition here is going to be overcosted bodies. And because the bodies are so overcosted and so slow, I don't really think tempo is going to matter that much. I just want to have Selenia, which gives all my creatures a significant boost with vigilance, and then I'm going to take fairly static. I mean, spoiler alert for what I'm going to take out of this next pack, probably. I'm going to take reasonably statted creatures and just try and build like a fair Magic deck.
I don't know if I agree with that, just because I mean, your logic makes sense, but at the same time, if my opponent plays a creature and I can just play a much bigger creature because all my spells are cheaper, like that just seems like a much better defense than vigilance.
But the question is, how much bigger is your creature for 1 additional generic mana?
I mean, great question.
In 1996, I don't think much. I think it was kind of a coin flip whether or not the creature was even bigger. It could even be smaller for more generic mana, as far as you know.
Fair enough.
Things get wild. Let's look at this actual pack, though, and I had to read a lot of these cards, Anthony. I assume you're in the same boat. So we're only going to touch on the rules text of the cards we're considering, but I will read the pack now. The pack is Helm of Obedience, Carapace, Witch Hunter, Sustaining Spirit, Order of the White Shield, Pox, Forgotten Lore, Balduvian Barbarians, Mystic Remora, Mana Barbs, Force of Will, Azure Drake, Withering Wisps, Pyroclasm, and Mud Slide. You've got Hannah, Anthony. All your spells cost 1 less to cast. What are you taking out of this pack?
Well, now I kind of regret that because one card really stands out to me. And to be to qualify this, I definitely don't have a lot of experience playing with these really old cards.
Yeah, I think we're going to do a bad job at this pack.
But even with that, Order of the White Shield really stands out as the most potent card here to me by a pretty wide margin.
I agree with you completely. I mean, the other cards that are like noteworthy in terms of, I think here we have to just talk about cards that clear a baseline level of playability, like better than a basic land in your deck. Not to be too exaggerated about this, but
basic lands are great Magic cards. It's a high bar to pass.
Carapace is a card I do not want to put in any Magic deck. Witch Hunter is a card I do. It's a 4-mana 1/1 that you can tap to deal 1 damage just to target player, or pay 1 white to tap it and return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. All white. Very weird card, but I have no intention of putting this card in my deck. I would probably sooner run another Plains, I think. Which is why I agree with you completely. Order of the White Shield, which is white for a 2/1 pro-black. You can pay white to give it first strike to end of turn. You can pay white to give it +1/+0 until end of turn. I think that is head and shoulders above the other cards of this environment. Now, I say that. I play Force of Will and I play Pyroclasm in my current fairly powerful cube. I don't play Order of the White Shield. But in this context, Pyroclasm I don't think is going to be that effective because I don't imagine there's going to be a really Actually, there probably is going to be a pretty sick Thallid deck in this cube. Thalids were good back in the day.
Yeah, Pyroclasm actually stands out to me as maybe the next most potent. I would have to think more about Pox, I think. But like the restrictive casting cost, and I don't think there's a way to really break that symmetry. But Pyroclasm seems pretty easy to break the symmetry on.
Just wait.
Yeah, just wait a little bit.
Just wait till your opponent plays their 4-mana 1/1 and then Pyroclasm them. Boom, got them. And then Force of Will, I think this card is also probably up there in terms of picks in this pack, just because, again, the card does things. I'd rather have it in my deck than a basic land, but it's rough in an environment where you don't have important stuff to answer on the first couple turns of the game, you're kind of basically looking at a 5-mana counterspell. This is not an environment where I'm going to want to 2 for all myself, is what I mean to say.
Yeah, it's really funny how Force of Will just scales inversely to the power level of the environment. If it's really fast and people are doing broken stuff very early, then losing that card parity is worth it just to stay alive. I was thinking about this the other day, like, is Force of Will even playable in my own cube, which is just like a little bit above retail limited power level?
I, for a long time, was of the opinion that Force of Will was not really playable outside of combo or really broken power-focused environments. And I've come around on that a little bit. I think it will be playable in your regular cube because it is still just a modal spell. I mean,
true.
The 5-mana counterspell will be used a lot more in your cube than I think it's used in my cube, or certainly it's used in like the Magic Online Vintage cube. But having that option to just like, oh, my opponent did, I tapped out, then my opponent did play their Archfiend of Ifnir, now I can Force of Will it. Like, that's a good option to have to answer. I guess that's not in the cube anymore, but whatever the power outliers are these days, being able to answer those if you need to is good modality on a 5-mana counterspell, which is a bad rate. But
right,
if you're countering a 5-mana spell, then it's 1-for-1, even on tempo, you're fine. It's just that doesn't come up very often. You usually want to counter things earlier on in the game. But I would play it in your cube. I would put it in my deck.
All right, but here I think it's even worse.
Here, I think it's even worse, yes. Although it is worth noting here that I expect a lot of the important plays of the game will come at 5 mana and above, like turn 5 and later, so I don't actually really know how to evaluate it. I think honestly, this cube is different enough from all the Magic you and I have ever played that I'm not confident at all in the kinds of picks we're making here. I mean, we've done pack one pick ones of old school cubes here before. I've played an old school cube once before. This is much less powerful even than an old school cube because we're looking at really just like alpha, beta, unlimited cards, pretty much. So really limited picks here. I'm very excited to get the Order of the White Shield. Those knights, the black and white knights in early Magic were notoriously very powerful. And I don't know. I'm going to gamble and take that Selenia Vanguard and hope that the generic mana reduction on casting my opponent's Witch Hunters or whatever is just not going to matter when they have Hannah. Could be totally wrong. I agree, in a vacuum, Hannah is enormously more powerful than Selenia or Tangarth.
Yeah, I think I'm also, even with my Vanguard pick, still going to take Order of the White Shield. Because, I mean, alternatively, I'm looking at, okay, Balduvian Barbarians now cost red with that Vanguard card, but I'd still rather have the Knight.
Right, and that's kind of what I meant by the one generic mana reduction maybe not mattering that much. How much are you going to be able to multi-spell in this environment? I actually don't know.
We'll find out.
We won't. We're not actually playing the cube. but I'm curious to know, Donato, if you agree with us, so maybe write in, give us a follow-up on what you would have taken out of this pack, because I'm sure you have much more experience with this environment than we do. But yeah, I feel a little bit lost, and I'm happy to see a 2-mana 2/1 that I can give First Strike and Pump in the first pack, because it feels like a nice, safe pick. Thanks, Donato, for sending in your cube. If you want to have your cube on Lucky Paper Radio, you can send it to me at luckypaper.co, and we will draft it on the air. 1-drops, Anthony.
Who needs them?
We have different views on 1-mana spells, I think. This episode is actually inspired by a semi-recent episode of Constructed Resources where, offhandedly, I think Andrew Beckstrom mentioned that the 1-mana spells in a constructed format are especially important in defining the texture and shape of that format. Like, whatever 1-mana spells you can play really help define what makes a constructed format feel like the metagame, right? It helps define what the available decks are and set some boundaries on how the format plays. I think a lot about trying to lower my mana curve in my cube, as we've talked about on this show many times before. So in that sense, I have thought about 1-mana spells quite a bit, but I do think they're kind of unique because they're defining nature, right? Like a 1-mana spell, and maybe we should we can talk a little bit about the difference between proactive 1-mana spells and reactive 1-mana spells, but any spell that costs 1 mana is the cheapest thing you can do in Magic, with rare exception. You do have 0-mana spells sometimes, the 0-mana cards. They do come up. You have some free cards out there. But it's the cheapest thing you can do in Magic from a mana perspective, and that is the resource that governs the tempo of the game.
Right, it's the atomic unit of the resource system.
Right, exactly. And because of that, the next cheapest thing you can do costs twice as much mana. Like, the relative difference in mana cost between a 1-mana spell and a 2-mana spell is 100%. Compared to the jump between 2 and 3 is 50%. The jump between 3 and 4 is 33%. And, it just gets smaller from there. So I think in that sense, specifically like talking about your curve in terms of what are your 1-mana spells and what are the rest of your spells can be somewhat relevant, because those spells are so important because they're so much cheaper than the next most expensive things.
I don't think I disagree with any of that. I mean, I think it's really important to, when you're designing a cube, to think about sort of the texture of the way that games can be sequenced and how people are going to assemble their deck. As a player, obviously, I totally agree that, yeah, they're powerful and they are what sort of structures the foundation of a lot of a lot of decks. And like we talked about recently, the cheap cards are really what make a format feel the way it feels, because you just are going to see them so much more.
Yeah, you get cast more.
6 drops can have a big impact on games, but you're just not getting to 6 mana every game.
And also, a lot of times, 6 drops just end the game, so they spend no real turns in play. Like, you cast your 6 drop, and then it's in turn for one. It's in play for one turn.
Therefore, they are bad.
Well, no, I think that's important. Like, the number of turns that a card spends in play is also going to scale with the cheaper spells, because the cheaper ones are going to be cast earlier and also stick around for the duration of the game, whereas the ones that are more expensive will naturally come towards the end of the game where there's not that many turns left. So that does change the way that, like, people have talked about this in terms of, like, you look at 6 mana planeswalkers like Elspeth Sun's Champion, or some people really like Will Kenrith or Liliana, these big 6 mana bomby planeswalkers. My perspective on those has always been, in my environment, like, yeah, they should be, like, oppressive to play against, because if you've gotten to 6 mana, the game should be over soon, right? Like, the game should hinge on 6 mana spells if you get to that point in the game. Either your opponent counters it, they remove it, or you get to win the game with it, because that's what those cards effectively should do. And so in that sense, it doesn't really matter mechanically what they do, except that it's win the game, right? Like, those planeswalkers can kind of be interchangeable, because at that point, like, the game's going to be over in a couple turns anyway, and so whatever they're doing is not going to have a huge impact on the board state and the decisions your players are making about how things actually play out.
Yeah, I mean, I would add the caveat just that 6 mana should win the game is definitely a matter of taste. Like, if that's what you're designing your cube around, that makes perfect sense. And I think that's going to come up with this whole topic, is that a lot of it is up to sort of what kind of gameplay you're looking for.
Yeah, some of it is, but the math is not, right? No matter what kind of gameplay you're looking for, a 1 mana spell is still half the cost of a 2 mana spell. And it's going to be way easier to multi-spell with 1 mana spells. What?
The Turbo Cube disagrees.
I mean,
you're right.
You've just changed what 1 and 2 mana spells are there. Like, there, 3 drops are now 1 mana spells, and 4 drops are 2 mana spells. And in that environment, 4 drops are so much worse than 3 drops.
Yes. Although 1 drops might still be better than 2 drops if your opponent has Thalia. Think about it.
It's true. It can come up. It can happen. So, you mentioned that it's important to think about how the decks in your format might sequence their plays and how games might play out. And I agree. I think that's actually one of the frames I like thinking about 1 drops the most in, which is, like, thinking about the different kind of decks you want to support, and whether that's for you in terms of, like, color pairs, like, you know, the 10 guild combinations, or whether that's in terms of big macro archetypes, like you're thinking aggro agnostic of color, you're thinking mid-range agnostic of color, you're thinking control agnostic of color. However you think about the sort of groups of decks in your environment, thinking about what you want them to do first, the first spell they cast, I think is a really important lens to consider when you're thinking about your environment. I have answers for these from my environment, and Anthony, I'm curious if you've ever thought about this perspective in the game. Like, have you ever thought about, like, what's the first play my decks are making? And if you have, what those answers are for you. I'll give you time to think about it, though. Well, I'll give mine. So I actually, in terms of, like, what the first thing my decks are doing in each game, I think in that sort of second frame. So I'm thinking aggro, mid-range, control are kind of the 3 big buckets I put the decks in my cube into. I don't support anything that really resembles combo. I have no win-the-game combos. That you can argue that's a 4th archetype. It's not supported in my cube, even if it's a thing by your definition of that word. So for me, my aggro decks, I want the first thing they do to be to play a threat. I want them to put something on board to threaten their opponent. And that means usually a 1-drop creature. And that can be, in my environment, in white, red, or black. You can be playing an aggressive, threatening 1-drop creature. So that's what I want my aggressive decks to be doing. It's probably the most straightforward thing. The first thing they're going to do is start threatening their opponent. Mid-range decks in my environment, I think of mid-range as kind of like the switch hitter of the sort of deck archetypes. I think if mid-range is playing against control, the first thing it wants to do is also start to land a threat and start to pressure their opponent. And if they're playing against aggro, the first thing I want them to do is, instead of doing that, play something that will either stifle their opponent's development or a removal spell to actually stop their opponent's development and, like, start trading and getting more time in the game. And so there, I think mid-range decks in my environment on turn 1 either want to be doing some sort of card selection to set up for whatever the thing that they're going to be responding to is. Like, if their opponent ends up being an aggro deck, you use some card selection to find that removal spell, find that 2-drop that blocks really well or whatever. They want to be playing some ramp, which basically says, like, no matter what your strategy is, I'm going to accelerate my own strategy so that I can get a tempo advantage on the next interaction, whatever that might be. Or in some cases, if they're on the draw, actually just play a removal spell. Or if, they get to turn 2 before they make their first play, just remove their opponent's threat and just start off the game by clearing things off. So mid-range is a little harder to find. I think that covers a broader range of what you can possibly do in the first couple turns of the game, but the first action can be. But that's what I expect there. And the control decks are the other extreme end of the spectrum. My control decks, I never expect them to play an early threat, ever, basically. And what I expect them to do in the early turns of the game is really just watch their opponent develop their board and make sure that they develop a nice curve of reasonable answers and hold up mana to respond at the appropriate times. And so for my control decks, the first thing I really want them to do is either hold up removal or interaction, whether that be a counter spell, a removal spell, whatever, or cast some sort of card selection, card advantage, hand smoothing cantrip or something to basically say, all right, while I'm waiting to see how this game is going to play out and how I ought to use my removal, how I ought to use my counter spells, I'm going to be making sure I hit my land drops, making sure that I, keep my 5 mana spells buried in my deck for a while because I don't want to draw them right now. I want to draw them later in the game. Just kind of making sure the game plays out smoothly until they know how they want to actually use their threats. Do you have anything like this in your head for your cube, for what you expect your decks to do as their sort of first action in a game?
Definitely, and it makes a lot of sense, actually, as soon as you bring up ramp versus a proactive creature, that there really is a difference in sort of what's your whole game plan for this deck, for this particular match. What's your whole thing?
You gotta figure out what your thing is.
Figure out what you do! You had all summer to think of it.
And it starts with the first action you take in the game, right? If my first action doesn't fit with my plan, then that just is a weird space to be in. So that totally makes sense. In my own cube, I do feel similarly in terms of, I expect proactive decks to be starting with a creature, and slower decks maybe are, developing their resources or setting up to take advantage of other ways to recoup resources while interacting with their opponent. At the same time, my cube is much less pushed to the extremes in terms of aggro and control. It's more just flavors of mid-range. It's a much lower powered environment. So a lot of the really proactive one-drop creatures are things that I'm specifically also choosing because they have more relevance in the late game. They give you just a lot more flexibility in terms of not being an all-in aggro plan. So that aspect doesn't make as much sense. What I've thought a lot more about, and I apologize if this sounds like a little bit of a troll answer, but...
Actually, you were thinking about the wrong thing.
No, what I mean is I think that the first action a lot of decks are going to take, and they're sort of quote-unquote one-drop, is playing a tapped land.
It's Andy here from the future, editing the podcast, just to say that got a very weird issue with the audio coming up here for a second, where for some reason switching tabs made the audio speed up a ton. I am sorry about that. The issue resolves itself quickly, and I wish I understood computers.
That's not a troll answer at all. That's on my list of things. So I was actually going to at some point compare, just for rough numbers, the number of one-drops in my cube versus your cube. I would 100% count a tapped mana source as a one-drop. And they work in the same way that all one-drops work, right? In my control deck, I'm pretty happy to play a tap land on turn 1. The reason I have far fewer tap lands in my environment is because I don't like drawing them from the top of my deck. I don't like being forced to basically play a tap land when I need my third or fourth mana or whatever. But I'm very high on 1-mana cantrips, and a 1-mana cantrip to find the land is exactly the same as a tap land, right? And so that's an important thing to recognize. I mean, exactly the same in this lens. Obviously, it also feels graveyard synergies like Delve, it triggers spells matter stuff, it has a lot of other things as well. But in terms of just mana development, that's basically a tap land. So playing a tap land on turn 1, or any turn of the game, is basically saying, I'm going to use my mana this turn, this 1 mana, to improve my mana fixing on later turns of the game. And I think that tap lands are exactly, I think it's a very important frame to think of those as one-drop spells, basically.
Totally. And that really is a big part of the entire design of this cube, where I really wanted to play with the temples and the man lands and all these other lands that do interesting stuff at different points in the game. So I've deliberately scaled down a lot of the one-drops. But how it has evolved is that I've definitely shied away from that in some aggressive colors, because it's really, very quickly when I started playing this cube, it became clear how much there being a fastest deck that was pretty quick was really important just to the health of the entire format. So I've definitely shaved a lot of the tapped lands from the more aggressive colors, threw in a few shock lands and other things, and supported more one-drops in those colors.
Yeah, you mentioned that your environment is less extreme in terms of less aggro and less slow on the control, and I'm not totally sure I agree with that. I think it's a different kind of scale, but here's a question. When you sit down to play your regular cube, you draft a deck, do you approach turn 0 in an unknown matchup with some sense of what your deck wants to do, what your deck's game plan is?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
And is part of that, I expect to be the aggressor, or I expect to be the not aggressor.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, that to me is one of the most interesting parts of the game, and especially about playing limited. But the part that's really like double interesting to me is when there are those moments in a game where it shifts, where both players are sort of some kind of mid-range, and you expect to be the beatdown. Oh, but you know, because of the draw you had, or because your opponent managed to 2-for-1 you, suddenly you have to like take a back seat and start playing the control game. Or, you know, that turn where you realize, okay, I actually can start using my resources in a different way and be the aggressor from this point until something else changes in this game. So I think
Do you think that happens more often in your cube than in a cube like mine?
Well, my gut reaction was yes, but
I'm not sure it does, just because, I mean, like, so every time you sit down in a match with the concept of you being the control deck in that match. And again, that doesn't mean you're playing any kind of prescriptive control deck. You don't have to be playing blue. You don't have to be playing board wipes, whatever. Like, it doesn't mean you're meeting any definition of a control deck. It just means that you expect to be the slower of the two decks and want to go to a longer portion of the game. You think your cards are better, more valuable than your opponents. And if you don't lose on tempo, you will eventually win on value. I think anytime you start with that assumption and eventually win the game, you had to go through that change you're describing. You had to go through the point where it's like, and now I'm actually the aggressor now because I'm turning the corner and I actually have a chance to get my opponent dead.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely true to a degree.
Like, I guess here's what I'm saying. I think my environment is overall much faster than yours, but I don't necessarily think the range between the fastest and the slowest is a bigger range. I think that whole range is shifted down, but my slowest decks need to have cheap turn one interaction. They need to be fast in a sense in order to keep up with the fast decks, right? And so it's like, I don't think that it's maybe as polarized as perhaps you're portraying it.
Now, that's an interesting idea. Not that it's slowed down, but that actually just means there's more space for like a more extreme contrast between the really, really slow decks that are like, I might deck myself before I actually find a way to win.
Well, that can happen in any cube.
Ones.
That can happen in the turbo cube. That can happen in the degenerate micro cube.
Sure can.
That can happen anywhere.
But yeah, I think the other thing you just touched on there is that regardless of what your plan is, still having cheap spells matters. Even if your plan is to be the slower, more controlling deck and you expect to win on the value axis later on, you still need to be able to deal with your opponent's one-mana spell. Otherwise, you're just going to be in a bad situation. Whether that means, you know, just playing a bigger creature that can block it, or having cheap removal, or, you know, any other manner of responses.
Yeah, I mean, and we always circle around talking about tempo. It's like a subject that we are always talking about to some degree. But I think ultimately, like, the tempo is a facet of the environment, and that dictates the playability of threats and answers. So if you have some environment that is just chock full of one-mana threats and all the answers start at 3, the answers are all just bad. They're unplayable. They can be the best 3-mana answers ever printed, things that see play in Legacy and Vintage or whatever, but if it's an environment where the tempo dictates that you have to be able to answer things much sooner, it doesn't matter how good those individual spells are. You can print 3-mana, you know, destroy 3 target creatures. Well, that's getting a bit of an exaggeration. It's a bit of an exaggeration, maybe, but it's going to be a lot worse. So anyway, I'm not sure that our cubes are that different in that regard. I think that you do have to, in both environments, start the game with a plan. I've never drafted your cube and started the game thinking, well, in some really mid-rangey cubes, I do not start the game with a sense of like what my plan is relative to my opponent. I'm not thinking I'm a fast or slow deck. I'm just like, I'm going to try and cast my cards on curve and hope that shapes up into something reasonable. I don't love playing cubes like that because I feel like it does come down to card quality and luck a little more often than when you actually have a focused plan. But that's what a lot of retail limited is. Would you agree that in a lot of retail limited, you don't really sit down turn 0 and think, I'm the aggressor or I'm not the aggressor?
I mean, I think there are other facets to having a plan that are not just am I the aggressor or not? Like,
sure.
I don't think that limited is at that point where it's just like, we're just gonna, you know, draw our cards and see what happens and make the best of it. But it definitely is less extreme in terms of, you know, I have a bunch of red 1-drops. My plan is to try and deploy these in the first 3 turns and get my opponent dead as quickly as possible. Like, that's a much more extreme version of having a plan.
I haven't played very much retail limited over the pandemic, so I'm like out of touch with contemporary retail limited sets. But when I think back to a set like War of the Spark, for example, that was the kind of set where there wasn't, to my memory, like a very defined aggro deck, and so it very much was like, all right, I'm going to draft whatever colors seem open, wherever colors I'm getting past the best cards in. I'm going to put them in my deck, and I'm going to hope to, you know, draw them and play them on curve. I don't mean to minimize how much strategic complexities involved there, because there is a lot of complexity. It's just that complexity unfolds before you when you start with your opening hand and see what your opponent does. You don't start with any footing of where you expect the game to go, which you then have to adjust as the game evolves.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's still degrees of it, but I see what you're saying.
Anyway, so the 1-drops in my cube, as I mentioned, I have a lot of cheap threats in my aggressive colors because I want my aggressive decks to be able to start with a cheap threat. And it's hard to overstate how much I value the cheap threat. Anything on turn 1 is better than nothing on turn 1 in these aggro decks that threatens your opponent. So I play what some people would probably call sketchier aggressive 1-drops, specifically ones that have value in the late game. So a good example of that is something like Fairy Guidemother. I know a lot of cube designers at my power level don't like Fairy Guidemother because they're like, oh, it's a 1-mana 1/1. It's not good enough. I like it because in the games where I have no other 1-drop, I'm happy to play a turn 1/1 flyer because it's going to get in there for 3, 4, 5 damage. It's going to be like a pretty significant, lava spike basically to my opponent's face because it's got flying and they're not going to have a flying blocker that early. And they're not going to want to spend a removal spell on it. And it has the late game value of being able to jump something with that sorcery speed, combat trick-like effect on the adventure side, which makes it better in the late game than drawing, an Isamaru Hound of Conda, which would have been maybe a little better on turn 1 than Fairy Guidemother was. So all by means of saying, I have a lot of density of cheap threats in those colors because I really value having something to do on turn 1. And this is where that difference between 1 and 2 mana, I think, is really prominent. I think the best start for an aggressive deck in my environment is generally turn 1, 1-drop, turn 2, 2 more 1-drops. That is so much better than turn 1, 1-drop, turn 2, 2-drop, or God forbid, turn 1, nothing, turn 2, 2-drop. Just having that many more threats, that much more power in play, puts your opponent under a much faster clock than anything else. So the fact that you can play 2 of these alongside each other, 2 1-drops alongside each other, is very different than playing a 2-drop.
Do you think it's actually more powerful, though? Because a 2-drop is going to be, for the most part across the board, more powerful than a 1-drop, just in terms of what the card does.
For sure.
So it's kind of card disadvantage to say, I'm going to play these cheaper cards that I can deploy faster, but overall, the amount of stuff that your deck can do is less. If those were just 6-mana spells, the total amount of power in the deck would be so much higher, right?
Yeah, and that is kind of like a heuristic that obviously changes depending on the actual board state. In my White Weenie deck, I'm going to go turn 2 Thalia because Thalia on turn 2 is so oppressive against so many decks that are going to try and cast non-creature spells to draw cards or turn the corner or remove stuff that's worth it over any 2 sort of equal 1-drops. But basically, I guess the way to look at it is that the aggro decks in my environment are trying to win on tempo. They don't really care about card advantage or card disadvantage,
right? Of course,
for the most part in the early game. And so if you take any 2 1-drops and just combine them into 1 2-drop card that gave the effect of producing those 2 tokens or doing whatever those 2 1-drops did, that'd be better than almost any 2-drop in my cube, just in terms of raw power level. Huh. Why it's not is because it costs you 2 cards, but if you're the aggressor and you're in the early portion of the game and you don't have a whiff of being in the mirror or something, what you're trying to do is abuse that tempo as much as possible, turn cards into board presence, into tempo, into life loss from your opponent as quickly as you can. That's
interesting. So I feel like, to me, the more relevant part seems just like the sequencing flexibility. If we instead just thought about
that's
this
very relevant too,
perspective on an aggro deck, you're trying to cast your spells on curve, use all your mana every turn, and get your opponent dead. What if you were just guaranteed to say you are going to have a 1-drop and then a 2-drop and then a 3-drop, and you're going to be able to use all your mana every turn? Wouldn't you still be favored just to have those more expensive spells?
Sure, yeah. So if you're saying if you could basically always guarantee you're going to curve out perfectly,
right? Then
yeah, you probably just want that over playing 1-drop, 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 and just
and then running out of cards. That's where the fact that it is sort of in a way a kind of card disadvantage to be running these cheaper cards which do less.
Yes, and then in some senses, again, it's a heuristic again that is. There's all sorts of reasons to abandon that heuristic, but oftentimes if you do have a 2-drop in hand, you'll play that on turn 2 just because the 1-drops you might have in hand are going to allow you to use up all your mana on the next turn of the game as well. Whereas if you were to go 1-drop, 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 and then you're stuck with 2 2s in hand, now you can't play 2 2-drops on turn 3 because you only have 3 mana. If you had gone 2-drop, you could go 2-drop, 1-drop on this turn. So there's a lot of considerations, but
I think that's really the critical piece where, again, we're saying these spells cost the atomic unit of mana. It can't be less than that, which means you can always fit them into your curve. If you have only 2-drops in your deck, you draw 2 drops, you can play 1 on turn 2, you're not going to be able to play 2 on turn 3. You're going to lose a mana. And
Yeah.
that's really what so many games come down to, is just who can
Yeah.
actually use their mana completely and efficiently. So the fact that 1 mana spells can both be played on turn 1, so you're not losing that turn 1 mana, and then also on turn 3 fill in your curve. And I think it's also relevant to think that when we're just talking about the relevance of cheap spells because they let you sequence your turns to use all your mana, the 2-drops are also very important. It's just like the further you go down the scale, the more difficult it is to fit in all these different mana costs. So,
And they're big steps in my eyes.
they're huge steps.
Very,
yeah.
very big steps.
So a 1 mana spell can always fit into any curve. A 2 mana spell sometimes can. And then I think it is relevant that if you have just a combination of 2 and 3s is still going to be better than just 2s, because you can cast a turn 2 spell, a turn 3 3-drop, and then if you
Turn
get
4,
up to
2 2-drops.
right.
Yeah.
And then turn 5, you can play a 2 and a 3. So there's like always opportunity to double spell and use all your mana all the way up the curve. So I think that, yeah, 1s are, the most flexible. 2s fit in a lot of spaces. 3s kind of work well with 2s. And then beyond that, things are, hopefully your spells are doing a lot because
You're committing a whole
you're
turn.
committing a turn to them, right?
Yeah. I wonder if there's some complicated math we could do here. We can get Jed on the line. I feel like we could do some simulations basically to say like, all right, the goal is using all of your mana on the first 4 turns of the game, right? That's the goal, and we're gonna like simulate games with just curves of cards. Doesn't matter what the cards do, just some number of 1-drops, some number of 2-drops, some number of 3-drops, or whatever, and see what different curves will use all of their mana on the first couple turns of the game, and make a graph basically like this many decks have fallen off by turn 4, 5, 6 in terms of using all their mana, either because they ran out of cards, because if you have a deck of all 1-drops, it will use all of its mana every single turn of the game, but will be out of cards by turn 4 basically every game pretty much, unless you're stuck on 2 lands, and then decks with much more expensive cards will be better in that sort of mid to late game. This is a simulation we got to do. I think we can make this happen.
We can do that.
So
We have the technology.
but all that is a great example of why 1-drops are so important, because if you are trying to use your mana efficiently, and this can be either proactive as an aggressive deck or reactively, right? If you want to be able to play a mana rock and also remove your opponent's threat, if your removal spell costs 2 mana, you're going to have to wait a whole other turn before you can do that than if you just have a 1-mana removal spell. You have your Disfigure, you have your Fatal Push, or whatever. So my aggressive decks are all using those sort of cheap 1-mana threats. Something else I want to mention here, which I think is important to this the fact of the 1-mana spell being the atomic unit of the mana system, is that it's really difficult to get out-tempoed when your spells cost 1 mana. Which is to say that we've talked before about how it is a tempo disadvantage if you have some sort of game exchange occur. You are even on cards, you 1 for 1 to each other, 2 for 2 to each other, whatever, but you are down mana, then your opponent gained a tempo advantage because they were able to presumably do other stuff with that mana instead of just, doing nothing. So you play a 5-mana creature, your opponent destroys it with a 2-mana removal spell, and plays a 3-mana creature. And now you've lost in that exchange because that extra 3 mana that you spent on that creature that was removed completely by a 2-mana removal spell, your opponent could do something else with, whatever they were doing with. So that's a good heuristic. It's like you don't generally want to be down mana in exchanges. When you're playing things that cost 1 mana, either, again, threats or answers, it's very hard to be down mana in those exchanges. It's possible. Your 1-drop can eat half of a Forked Bolt, and then that was kind of like half of a mana it costs to remove your thing.
You got mental misstepped or gut shot.
You got Ment Step, you got gut shot, you do have some things.
And that's why gut shot is the most powerful Magic card.
It's a true statement. So it's possible, but it's not very common in most Magic for that to be the case. And so, in addition to everything else we already said about smoothing out your curve, on a pure power level perspective, playing 1-mana threats and answers is a good way to just insulate yourself against tempo losses. You're using all your mana, and in exchanges on the board, you are generally going to be doing pretty well in terms of mana exchanges. An important thing that you kind of alluded to is that, especially when it comes to threats, your 1-mana threats might just be brick-walled at some point by your opponent's 3-drop. They play a Brimaz, and if you don't have a removal spell for it, any number of 1-drops you played on the turns prior are now going to be stonewalled and effectively removed for the time being. Like they're kind of effectively under some O-ring that says they can't attack or block because they're just going to die as long as this Brimaz is around. And that's a kind of virtual card advantage that's important to think about. Or your opponent, board wipes or something. Those situations can come up where there's a sort of big swing in the other direction. Similarly, your cheap removal spells at some point just don't kill the big enough stuff, right? Like I love Disfigure, I love Shock, I love Fatal Push, but they don't kill 5-drops basically at all. And so at some point, those become card disadvantage because they're just cards that don't do anything in your hand anymore because they don't remove stuff. And so that is the sort of flip side of that coin, is that it's hard to lose out in tempo on game states, but it's easy to lose value at some point because you effectively have to have card disadvantage because you're playing worse, cheaper cards than your opponent is.
Right, and I think that tension is really meaningful. So if I can just go ahead and contradict everything we've been saying. So yes, 1-mana spells are in many cases in a lot of contexts very powerful. They're very important to players' plans. I don't think that's necessarily universal to all formats. So especially if we look at, maybe this isn't as true in limited sets from the last year or two, but a little bit further back, 1-drops really just weren't that important because they didn't provide that value. They just weren't generally worth a card, because if you play a 1-mana 1/1, it's great that you use your mana efficiently, but you're going to lose out on the value axis when your opponent just plays a 2-mana 2/2 that you now can no longer block.
And in basically every limited environment in the past 20 years, 2-mana 2/2s are a thing to expect.
Right, for sure. So I think that as much as 1-drops are important in the sense that we should think about them and consider as cube designers how they fit into environments, and as players how they form sort of the fundamental first action of our plan, I don't think that means you as a cube designer need to go out and say, okay, well, because these are important, I need to add a ton of them to my cube. If you are just interested
I'd
in that,
advocate for that.
if you're interested in that slower format, like whatever sort of mana curve, whatever you choose to put in the cube, there's still going to be an optimal way to draft, and your players will do their best to figure that out. I don't think you need to say, well, we need to have more of this because it makes the games fundamentally better.
No, definitely not. Absolutely not. I do think that they tend to be powerful, and if you look at especially bigger pool constructed formats, the curves are lower and lower and lower because the bigger pool you have, if you're just trying to power optimize, you will just play more cheaper cards as much as you possibly can.
Maybe this goes without saying, but when you're designing a cube, you probably have in mind sort of a curve of what you expect decks to look like in terms of the mana cost they're going to be playing. And it does make sense to, reflect that curve in the whole cube itself. So if your desire is to have a cube where decks are playing a ton of 1-drops, a couple 2-drops, a couple 3-drops, that's what sort of the whole makeup of the cube should look like.
If anything, even a little more exaggerated, I think, in that regard. If you have the exact same curve in a cube that you expect to be in your decks, then on average, that's what people will get, but you want to give your players the power to draft those lower curving environments, and so they will oftentimes need even a higher density of low curve stuff to make sure they have the cheap stuff, because the more expensive stuff is easier to come across.
Is it easier to come across just because, if it truly matched 100%, the distribution of mana costs and, types of effects that you wanted, wouldn't everything be equally desirable?
I guess in theory, what happens in practice is that, the things that higher up on the curve end up being more flexible to go in different kinds of decks. I don't know. I don't know is the answer.
Okay. Ultimately, there's some wiggle room because in most cubes, you're not literally playing every single card in all decks. So I think it's a good heuristic to sort of trend towards, but it is not an absolute rule, and things aren't going to be broken if you err a little bit in one side.
I guess what I mean, if you have if you take into account the variance of the packs, just how things are going to break down and how you're going to get past stuff. If you want to, when your players don't get the perfect draft, they don't get the perfect average of the curve in your environment, if you want them to be able to trend towards the lower curve instead of trending towards the higher curve, then you want to trend your environment that way, because when things go off the rails and you have a pack that has all your 1-drops in it and you have to pass it and then all your 1-drops get taken before the wheel, then you'd rather have more of the cheap stuff than more of the expensive stuff in general.
Maybe we could just say you love 1-drops.
I love 1-drops.
You should play you should play a lot of what you love.
Look, this comes down to much more subjective stuff. The reason I like 1-drops is because I maintain that one of the most fun things in Magic is just taking game actions. It sounds so silly, and we talk a lot about things that are kind of talking about power level and how to balance your cube and how to approach your cube as a spike-minded player. But honestly, I really feel like doing stuff, casting spells, drawing cards, taking game actions is just fun. That's
what the game
is.
If you're not taking
it's
game
called
actions,
a game action
you're not
for a
playing
reason.
the game.
And so it may sound silly, but you could just double the cost of every single spell in my environment, and you've been a big proponent of the costs don't actually matter, right? The numbers are all made up. You could just change them all, and who would care? Right.
And this that texture of sequencing is where that idea does really break down. So I'm glad we're talking about this.
Right. It's good to talk about and so the reason I really like 1-mana spells is not only because I'm trying to make my cube powerful, right? I'm not just trying to power max my cube, and that's why I came across cheap spells. I used to define my cube as my cube is very powerful. It's a legacy vintage cube or whatever. Here are the cards that are too powerful, but everything else you should assume is included, other than stuff I put on this like short, too powerful list. The number of cards I don't play, but I think would be perfectly competitively viable, they'd be very good in my cube, is very long. Like there's a lot of cards I'm just not playing because I don't like their play patterns, even though I think they're there at a power level reason. So I think a lot about play patterns, and the reason I include so many 1-drops is largely for a play pattern thing. Do I think Fairy Guidemother is one of the best 360 cards in Magic's history in terms of a pure power max cube like mine? I don't know, but I really like the fact that it's a 1-mana spell that I can play on turn 1, or it does something reasonable later in the game. And that's the reason it's included in my environment, because I want my players to get to making relevant strategic game decisions as soon as possible. And you could just double everything and say, all right, well, now we got to keep passing back and forth and drawing cards and playing lands, and then we sequence things much more slowly. And a lot of Magic would still hold up, right? You'd still have all the same questions of tempo and value and card evaluation. Like, it's not like the game is completely altered, but I think it's just much less fun. I think it's more fun to just do stuff.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. Everybody likes to take game actions.
And for all that, we, have kind of been portraying this as like, I love 1-drops and you're like, you prefer to play a tap land. You're
no,
like,
I love this. I feel much better about this framing. Actually, just makes more clear a lot of the stuff that I've thought about, maybe not as clearly. Where I just really do love like the Manlands and the Temples. I think they're great Magic cards, and I enjoy playing with them. And I do find a lot
more
of joy.
game actions on cards in your deck, because
Exactly.
otherwise lands don't have game actions. On
That's the correct way to evaluate a cube is game actions per card.
Game actions per card. How many game actions per deck can you jam in there?
But a lot of what I do enjoy is that kind of sequencing where it's like, okay, well, I have a tap land that I want to play turn 1, and then turn 3 I expect to play this 2-drop. So if I don't draw another untapped land, I'm gonna plan my sequence, and that's gonna count as using one of my 3 mana on turn 3.
Right. Exactly. So, but anyway, I was going to say that both of our cubes, yours included, have only trended lower in terms of converted mana cost. And I think at some point when you first started your cube, you had almost no 1-drops. Now you have quite a few. You have like 2/3 of the 1-drops I have in terms of 1-drop count. You have a couple extra cards in your cube. It's not a straight 360, but we've both trended down in terms of our overall mana cost. And for me, I don't see that trend changing. I'm not sure if you expect at some point to start raising the mana curve on the cards in your cube.
Now that you present the idea, I feel obligated to try it. But no,
a true contrarian, a true natural contrarian.
What I'm also observing, just again looking at this list, thinking about it in these terms, is that there are a lot of 1-mana spells that I just don't expect players to play on turn 1, and I think that's somewhat intentional. That it's more about getting to those double spell turns that I think are really like a lot of interesting Magic comes down to those turns, and so sure, you're not going to be bubble snaring, you're not going to be fungal infectioning turn 1, but because those cheap spells can fit into the curve later on, it does just create a lot of interesting gameplay.
Yeah, and just to again hammer home the whole this is not directly tied to power level thing, I would much rather play a lower power cube that still has a very low curve, right? Like, give me fungal infections, give me bubble snares, give me these cheap threats or these cheap answers that are still affordable. They're not super powerful. Like, that just still, I think, leads to the kinds of Magic turns I like to take. And I agree with you completely on that. One specific type of 1-mana card I want to talk about that I have a lot of in my cube, but I don't think you have any in your cube. Maybe you have one. You have Duress still in your cube, right?
Duress is in there. I think there's a Mind Rot variant, but
I was going to say 1-mana Hand Disruption is a particularly interesting card type, because this is a great example of, I think, that sort of switch hitter mentality of what these kind of 1-drops can do. So in some matchups with some decks, I'm very happy to Thoughtseize my opponent on turn 1. Generally, that's if I am a more controlling or mid-rangey deck. And what I either want is I want to mess up their curve so that they stumble and I can survive later into the game so I can draw my board wipes and draw my better cards and eventually win out. Or actually, I want to do that and also get a little bit of information about what they're doing so I can inform my further plays. If I'm a pure aggro deck, I will very happily put Hand Hate in there. I love Hand Disruption in my aggro decks. I do not want to play it on turn 1. I want to lead the first turn on a threat, and ideally the next turn, a threat plus a Thoughtseize. Because what I want to do is get the pressure on, which makes the hand hag that much more potent. If I just sit there and start hating my opponent's hands, then by the time I'm playing my threats,
you're not actually going to take advantage of that tempo
right.
disparity that you're trying to create.
Right, exactly. So Thoughtseizes and Inquisition of Kozileks and Duresses and all this kind of stuff, those cards, I think, are great examples of they're 1-mana spells that I expect different decks to play at different parts of the game, ideally. And in the aggressive deck, that's not turn 1. I want to be leading on a threat so that while I'm messing up your hand, your life total is also being drained by my threat that I put in play on turn 1. Ideally, I put into play a Knight of the Ebon Legion, then turn 2, I can shock in a shock land, Thoughtseize you, lose 4 life, and then it gets a +1/+1 counter without having to pump it.
The first time someone did that to me, I was confused and upset.
That card, I put Knight of the Ebon Legion in my cube kind of skeptically. I was like, I don't know. It doesn't seem that good. It's only got 1 power. It's got a lot of mana to pump it. And it's probably, I think, one of the best aggressive 1-drops in my entire cube across all colors. I think it goes like Ragavan, Goblin
which
Guide,
is
probably.
hardly a Magic card. I still refuse to
Ragavan is still ridiculous. I do have one last point before we wrap up here about Ragavan specifically. But anyway, I think Knight of the Ebon Legion is up there in terms of just raw power level for aggro 1-drops. The card is so great. I love it so much. Just dismember something, attack. It's great. On the point of Ragavan, this is my last salvo for 1-mana cards and why I love them so much. Is Ragavan the best 1-mana threat ever printed?
I assume so.
I think we can pretty safely say that at this point here today in 2021, August 28th.
Yeah, I mean, give it a week or two.
give it a year. I mean, might have something that's better. I mean, you could put like Deathrite Shaman up there in different constructed formats. If you have tons of fetches running around, Deathrite Shaman's pretty oppressive. Obviously, Delver of Secrets is an iconic 1-drop, but I think Ragavan probably in a vacuum in most formats takes the cake for just raw power level. Still dies to everything. We've had this conversation before. If you put 1-mana spells in your environment, they are basically never going to take over the entire game, which is a risk you do run with 3, 4, 5-mana spells of a relevant power level in your environment, because those spells are more committal. And if you're playing a 5-drop that people are going to take highly in the draft, they're going to excitedly put in their deck, they're going to try to cast, the things that make a player go through all those hoops and try and cast a 5-drop, even in a slower environment, like this is all within your control as a designer, obviously, but even in a slower environment, it's got to be a big payoff, because your players are going to make a big commitment to basically get that big payoff. And the 1-mana spells, while they insulate you from that sort of board-based tempo losses, they help you manage your curve, they let you take more game actions, and also I just think that more cheap spells, especially 1-mana spells, minimizes the blowout-y kinds of games that can happen sometimes, which I personally don't love. I don't love when non-games of Magic happen, and I found that the more I've lowered my curve and the more I've put emphasis on 1-mana spells, the less that happens, because the best 1-mana spells are still worse than almost every 2-mana spell.
Almost, yeah. I mean, there's a couple weird exceptions where it's like, oh, do I want a more expensive card that's better than Ragavan? I don't know if you're going to find many.
Well, the thing about Ragavan is it's also a 2-drop.
Also a 2-drop.
So it's a 1-drop, it's a 2-drop. Oh, and it pays for itself. Oh, boy, it's kind of a messed up card.
On the subject of 1-mana, I also want to advocate for 1-mana activations. This doesn't fit
get in there.
The same role, obviously, in terms of filling out your curve in the very early game, but I really love equipment or creatures with activated abilities. Anything that costs 1 to activate I find plays really, really well, just because it does in those later turns let you use your mana as efficiently as possible. And to sort of argue in a different direction than we have been so far, I actually like 1-mana activated abilities a lot more in a lot of cases than free abilities. Even though it's
I know where you're going with this.
Less powerful, you don't actually make a decision about a lot of free abilities. If you have a Merfolk Looter, you're just going to loot every turn. So yes, you're taking more game actions, but you're not taking more game decisions in a meaningful way. So I like just having a cheap cost that is that atomic unit that can be fit into your curve, but does ask you to pay a real cost.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said there. It makes a lot of sense from a cube design perspective. It offers your players more strategic decisions, but less game actions. And I gotta say, if you had to make me choose between game actions and strategic decisions, I'm probably gonna take game actions most of the time.
Wow.
I would rather get to loot every turn and be able to not have to make a decision of do I loot this turn or not, because it just gives me more cards to look at and more cards to see, and that's just more fun for me. I also there's that bummer effect of I can't do both. I have these two things and I can't do both.
That's part of it.
I know that's part of it. I know it is, and I wouldn't advocate for just having every spell cost 0 mana, and the whole point
we can play
the
on
whole
Missions
point of the
Cube
mana
if you want.
the whole point of the mana system is essentially just a structural way to say you can't do both. That's the whole thing. But it's nice that
would be great flavor text on Richard Garfield, PhD.
But it's nice that that is built into the game in a way that there's expectations set about it. When you read a card with 1-mana activation, obviously you're just thinking about how fun it's going to be to activate it, and not all the turns where it's not actually going to be correct to activate it and it's just going to feel bad, you know? Anyway, that's 1-mana spells, which eventually ended up being a lot about tempo, as it always is, and just generally about cube design theory. Well, that's it for us here at Lucky Paper Radio. Thanks to DJ James Nasty for producing all the music you hear on the show. Thanks to Wizards of the Coast for producing all the Magic cards we play with and enjoy, and the ones we don't enjoy. And thanks to you for listening. Anthony, it's been a pleasure talking about Magic with you.
It's been good to talk to Magic.
Feels like it's been a long time since we recorded, because we did do the pseudo recording last week, and I think the week before we had recorded.
We did it really early in
advance.
Preparation of
preparing for the weekend. So it's been a while since we actually did a normal episode, but it is genuinely a pleasure to talk about Magic with you.
Hey, thanks.